It's actually, I realize it's the first time I've actually been in this building, so I'm very glad to be here too and see you all and have this wonderful panel, which I think I will introduce, and then at the end I'll say a few words about myself too. But I have asked each of them to send me a little bio that describes how they want to describe themselves, because you know, you don't want to be always described by others. Maybe you want to describe yourself. So I'm just a reader. So Patty. Patty Chan is a second-generation Chinese-Canadian Erhu musician, educator, composer, and author. She is the music director of the Toronto Chinese Orchestra, co-founder of the Phoenix Ensemble with harpist Sanya Eng, and founder of the Center for Music Innovations. Having experienced the profound impact that music of her heritage has had on her identity and sense of belonging, she actively promotes the traditional yet pushes towards change and seeks collaborations to embrace cross-cultural dialogue between both audiences and artists, engaging with other cultural groups and art forms, led by her curiosity towards other ways of thinking, seeing, and interpreting, for the purposes of building new bridges through music. And we have collaborated here in Toronto at the last Future Resonance Festival, and that was real bridge building, I think. It was wonderful. So I'm very glad you're on the panel. Parmela. Parmela Attariwala. Born and raised on Treaty 7 territory, has been mesmerized by sound for as long as she can remember, particularly how unworded sounds carry meaning. I like that, the unworded sound. So, very specific. Yeah. Nevertheless, her route to becoming a musician and ethnomusicologist were completely accidental. As a teenager, musicking was Parmela's escape from an otherwise socially restrictive upbringing. While a science major, Parmela's mentor staged a coup on her plans to become a neurosurgeon. I didn't know about that. By facilitating an audition to Indiana University. Later, in endeavoring to move from then racist Switzerland to England, a friend suggested Parmela enroll in ethnomusicology at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Like most Western classically trained musicians of a generation, Parmela had no idea what ethnomusicology encompassed. It changed her life. Over a 20-year sojourn in Toronto, Parmela completed a PhD and cultivated a multimodal interdisciplinary practice. That's the part most of you probably know about. Now based in Vancouver, she continues to perform, compose, improvise, and teach while advocating for equitability and ethics in the world of musicking. I just need to manipulate the microphone a little bit. I hope that's better. So, great to have you here too. And I'll talk about Anthony now. Anthony R. Green is a composer and performer invested in social justice artistry. Green's practice of continuous questioning and lifelong study is centered on epistemological hyperbole, the embodiment of injustice and the metaphysics of the oppressed. Recent works concern the power of women, the agency of marginalized people, and the climate crisis. His diverse projects have been presented in over 25 countries across 6 continents in venues including Elbphilharmonie in Frankfurt, Hamburg, Cité de la Musique et de la Danse in Strasbourg, the Shoe Factory in Nicosia, Cyprus, and Lincoln Center in New York. Since co-founding Castle of Our Skins in 2013, Green has researched music by Black composers across history and geography, and the various political realities implied by their lives and music. He regularly lectures and exhibits interdisciplinary performances globally, and is currently a visiting professor at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in Glasgow. Glad to have you here. We met in Istanbul a few years ago and had very intense conversations, so I'm glad we're continuing that here. And Dylan, last but not least, is a xwélmexw, is that good? Yeah. xwélmexw artist, curator, and writer. From 2015 to 22, he was the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts at Queen's University and currently is an associate professor at the University of British Columbia. His curatorial work includes the international touring exhibition Soundings from 2019 to 25, co-curated with Candice Hopkins. His current research project, which also has a title that I won't pronounce in Caring for Our Ancestors, involves working with Indigenous artists to reconnect kinship with Indigenous life incarcerated in museums. One of his books, Hungry Listening, by University of Minnesota Press, has won several awards and is one of the books that have had a major impact on a shift in how we think about music making and sound making going forward. By moving away from our previous focus on musical products, scores, sound files, or performances, towards an understanding of sounding as an activity that is embedded in a web of relationality, and that is generally better understood and more fairly treated if we keep in mind the agencies and positionalities of everyone involved within this relational sounding web. Dylan's work specifically examines frictions between Indigenous and settler colonial practices of listening. As a co-chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council for the Canadian Music Centre, he, for example, is currently leading a process for the reparation of and redress for musical products that appropriate Indigenous song and thereby misrepresent Indigenous culture. Thank you, Dylan, for being here, and I'm looking forward to an excited discussion. I will just say a few words about my own positionality. So my own name is Sandeep Bhagwati. I've been leading over the past 6 decades or so pretty much unrooted or uprooted life across several continents. Neither my parents nor I have ever settled anywhere. I've been for more than 2 decades professed my love to music as a professor at universities in Germany, Canada, and elsewhere. For 1 decade, I was a Canada Research Chair in Inter-Ex Art, Practice and Theory at Concordia University, where I still teach. I'm active as a composer, ensemble leader, and I dabble in some other arts, such as poetry and theater or exhibition arts. Come to the Aga Khan Museum. It's an exhibition, not a concert. It's called How to Inhabit These Different Temporalities, which is something that has a lot to do with what we're talking about today. Brian did such a great acknowledgement of thanksgiving for the land and the culture of the land. And I'm always a little envious as somebody who lives in a floating world of non-alliances, no home whatsoever, no claim to any, indigeneity myself. And so I thought a little about, is there anything that I should be giving an acknowledgement to or thanks for? And I would like to acknowledge that this ritual form of speaking that we're about to engage in, so this exploratory panel discussion based on giving equal voice to stakeholders, as many as one can get, in a particular situation, owes its existence to a strong tradition of intellectual practices supported and defended by often non-government and often anti-government institutions that originated and evolved in various societies across the history of ancient and modern Europe mostly. Like calls for equality, diversity, and inclusion are deeply rooted in this continuously evolving tradition around an ideal of human rights and evidence-based discourse. So that is something that I feel rooted in and responsible for or responsive towards. As we explore the divergences between ideals of this and the lived reality, which is not ideal, and as we realize how the circle of stakeholders that initially was very small is continuously widening, the areas in which these things are being implemented are continuously widening. I respect and acknowledge the continued connections of the current debates with this ideal in ongoing relationships with human and non-human actors in the world around us. So that is my thanks or acknowledgement. So that's the introduction, a very long introduction. And now let's ask the questions. You saw the blurb, probably on the website, that's why you're here. And one of the things that is very important, I think, at this stage of the discussion, I assume that most of you who are here already see the need for change in concepts of what has always been called new music, or Western-centric, Eurocentric, modernist new music, and the need for widening of the horizon and so on, decolonization, inclusion, and so on, diversity. All these keywords are pretty much not accepted in the society at large, but I suppose they are in this room. So the question comes now, so what's next? What is the next step, or where do we go from here? From the acknowledgement and from the, we see that there are inequalities everywhere, power differentials everywhere. We have noted them, we have talked about them at large. And what are the possible things that are positive? So we can criticize, but what are the positive things that, all these movements, these thoughts bring for our practice as musicians, as musicologists, as thinkers, as audiences? And so that was my question to the panelists, and I've asked all of them to prepare a crunchy statement. Crunchy implying both that it's short and that it is controversial, a little bit at least. So let's go in that order maybe as we're sitting. I would invite Parmela to first. It's all very amplified here.
I don't like amplification. Anyone who knows me knows. Some of you know me. I lived here for many years. I played the violin, 1680 violin. It doesn't like to be amplified. I don't like it amplified. Oops, thank you. Okay. About 17 years ago, I was invited to sit on a panel of diverse musicians in Canada for a National Arts Service organization. Not just a panel of diverse musicians, but newcomer Canadians. I was in the throes of a PhD dissertation writing, and as such had prepared a written statement. Ours was the last panel of the conference, but by the time it was our turn, the conference was an hour overtime. There was no time for prepared statements. We were going straight to the Q&A. I made one statement. Years later, people have said they remember it. There are two things that I do not take well: being considered less worthy of time, space, opportunity, being assumed to be not really Canadian, and with that, the plethora of assumptions that come with having a history from somewhere else, and of therefore not quite fitting in. Some things have changed in the interim 17 years, and some have not. I continue to fight against the devaluation of others, against the devaluation of people and their essential humanity, and for today's discussion, the devaluing and undervaluing of others' ways of musicking. I include in the definition of devaluing the not sharing ownership, authorship, copyright, and royalties, the not sharing of professional compensation for time and knowledge, and everything that goes beyond the taking of a bow after a performance. I recently learned that the principal author of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights was a man named John Peters Humphrey. I don't know if anyone's heard of him. A legal scholar from Hampton, New Brunswick. The promise embedded in the UN Declaration is the same promise embedded into the Canadian Constitution. This promise laid the foundation for every endeavor to create equitability based on an ethics of reciprocal respect for our innate humanness. This is what being Canadian has always meant to me. This is why, as a violinist, I have continued to sacrifice having a healthy income when the alternative meant putting up with overt and covert racism and misogyny. My grandfather, who was brought to Canada as a child laborer, refused to go back home when his contract with the Canadian Pacific Railroad ended. He refused because he recognized the promise of equity, and he recognized that should he ever have a daughter, she would not experience any notion of equity in the Punjab that she might in Canada. So while we might claim John Peter Humphreys as our own, each of us who are settlers fails to live up to the Canadian promise when it comes to the people of this land. How do we, including those of us with roots in decolonized countries and who constructed the decolonizing agenda, according to the countries where the colonizers ruled but did not necessarily settle, how do we uncolonize? How do we uncolonize our world of musicking? We must learn from our Indigenous colleagues. Were it not for them, I would have given up on Western art music institutions years ago. But when I was when I was tasked with co-writing an equity report for Orchestras Canada 7 years ago, I came to realize just how invested my Indigenous colleagues are in the forms emanating from the Western art music system, in orchestras, operas, chamber music, in the replicating of old musics from Europe, and in the creating of new works, infused to various and sometimes negligible degrees, with their stories, their perspectives. When we give due respect to the various manners by which knowledge keepers of non-European or non-Western classical music impart the wisdom that we seek when we embark on a collaborative work, we must learn to respect the process by which it happens. The time that it takes may be much slower than what our definitions and our professional organizations dictate as commensurate with being professional. And it is at this juncture that we must find a middle ground. The Canadian Federation of Musicians and every musician represented by them must find a middle ground whereby differing scales of pay are given to recreative, performance-oriented works and to process-based works. Other disciplines have this, music does not. And as someone who spent a lifetime performing, this is a problem, and I see it over and over with my colleagues who refuse to give any, who refuse to be elastic with their time and their pay. We must also respect as equal the content that is shared with us. The box-ticking collaborations that allow our art music institutions to receive funding need to become just and fair. It is a systemic issue that must involve and intersect with our music educators, our professional training institutions, our unions and professional associations. Until the idea of respect and parity is embedded into every manner of musical structure, the valuing of music and musicians throughout Canadian society will continue to decline. But I believe there is hope, and it lies with the people on whose land we live. Today, I live on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As was announced before, I was born and raised on Treaty 7 territory, less than a kilometer from the Tsuut'ina lands, and I spent much of my childhood playing on the beautiful grasslands there. And I spent 25 years here in Toronto, knowing I was an outsider, but not knowing that I was an outsider because I was on Treaty 13 territory. It is easy to not know this about Toronto when our senses are overwhelmed with the extraordinary wealth of ethnocultural diversity that flourishes in this cosmopolitan city. In the past week, I have heard extraordinary music making, all of it a product of musicians who now live here. The range of ethnocultural heritages and genres they come from, and the liminal musical spaces they've carved, represent the global north, south, east, and west. But I suspect few, if any of you in this room, have heard these musicians play. They do not play in our Western art music spaces. They don't earn our CFM pay rates, but their level of musicking is as professional. And to me, they represent the sound of Toronto. This is something I recognized when I first moved here. And after 25 years, I was fed up because it wasn't happening. It wasn't changing. We weren't recognizing it. These are the musicians that I want to bring to Vancouver and say, hey, listen to this. And there's a lot more of it where it comes from. Thank you.
I have to follow that. There is some overlap, though.
I'm sure there's a lot.
Yeah. So, firstly, I'm not from Canada. I'm from the United States. I grew up on Narragansett and Paukunaukit and Wampanoag land, and that's more conveniently referred to as Providence, Rhode Island. And my statement is a little bit of a thought experiment. So, on the one hand, the reality that I'm about to present to you is partly known and felt, but it's highly unlikely that the deeper contemplation of this reality has taken up space in your life. And this is what I want my opening statement to accomplish. So with that, just imagine waking up tomorrow and the classical music world, on the whole, universally, without any arguments, decides to never program a piece by a white male composer. Just imagine that. I'm not advocating this. I love Beethoven, I love Chopin, I love Bach, right? But in all reality, this would be one step towards real programming justice, and it would be a programming justice boost for every organization. It would increase the amount of research into music that has not or has been rarely programmed because old war horses or mediocre competition winners have taken up space of innovative works by diverse composers. And it would, in the long run, increase awareness of music and composers that desperately need and deserve more exposure. So let's just go on with this thought experiment. This one change alone will not change any of the following. Firstly, an over 100-year history of music history and music theory books that contain very little to no stories or music examples by and about black composers, female composers, or composers of color, especially from the global south, with the exception, perhaps, of Hildegard von Bingen, Ginastera, Villa-Lobos, and also some white composers from South Africa and Australia. Point 2, it won't change the existence and development of the segregationist branch of musicology called ethnomusicology that perhaps has good intentions, but still continues to reaffirm an us versus them mentality with regards to music practice. Now, there's lots of conversation about this, and a lot of that is changing for the better. Point 3, it won't change a German-focused pedagogy that places certain composers on a pedestal while simultaneously using their music as a metric to judge all other music created rather than appreciating novel approaches that are unrelated to any German or European approaches. Point 4, it won't change a history of European and white American, all the Americas, not just the United States, by the way, composers incorporating and or appropriating musics from other cultures and getting all the praise and societal innovation points, while the music and the contributions of the origin culture are conveniently ignored or underappreciated. And I'm thinking specifically about works like Debussy's Pagodes, Balakarev's Islamé, Fritz Kreisler's Tambourin Chinois, Dvorak's New World Symphony, Michael Tippett's A Child of Our Time, and more contemporary composers such as Ted Hearn's Katrina Ballads and Caroline Shaw's Partita for 8 Voices, which won a Pulitzer. Point 5. It won't change in almost 100-year history of decent quality recordings where there are literally thousands of recordings of certain pieces and 0 to 5 recordings of others. And quite often, the quality is not as high, leading to a culture of people who are enthusiastic about discussing recordings and interpretations, but they don't have options for pieces like an opera by Harry Lawrence Freeman, or Battle of Manassas by Blind Tom, or Beautiful Dances by Ludovic Lamotte, who is nicknamed the Haitian Chopin. You know what? I have to skip because this is going to go very, very long. But I do want to mention that the classical music world has successfully branded itself as being the genre of music creation and practice that is the most rigorous and the most sophisticated. And such branding has resulted in superhumanly talented musicians of other genres being brainwashed into thinking that they are not real musicians. I can't tell you the amount of incredibly talented, mostly self-taught gospel and jazz musicians telling me that I have true technique as a pianist and that they're jealous of me when in reality I will never be able to do what they do naturally, and I'm totally jealous. And this phenomenon continues today. So as much as my work focuses on programming justice, which I still feel is extremely important to change how we as members of the classical music world view, discuss, analyze, prioritize, and teach classical music, bringing this extreme programming justice to soloists and ensembles will not change the way that classical music has not been immune to the racist, segregationist, otherist principles that have dominated Western society and still continue to do so. And when we think about the climate crisis, our world doesn't have another 500 years if we keep on living this way. So classical music won't start over again, and it can't. On the flip side, women and people of color will never stop. And that, to me, is the most beautiful aspect of the classical music world. Thank you.
So that's going to be a difficult act to follow as well. My statement, actually, it's very ethnographical. It's mostly my experience here, growing up in Toronto. So I was born in Toronto, and as a visible minority, I did face some bullying, and I was always asked, I was always put into ESL every time I changed a school, and that wasn't, I didn't even utter a word, and the assumption is that, oh, you're a foreigner, and you should probably be going to learn English. So at school, that is what happened to me, and then outside of school, from my own community, if they're new immigrants, they would consider me not as Chinese because I was born here. And so they called me a banana. So they think that I look yellow on the outside and white on the inside. So I had grown up in those challenging situations where, I didn't know where I belonged. And so it was through community music that actually helped me find my identity. The community music, my parents wanted me to learn Chinese culture, Chinese music, and so they encouraged me to learn about the Chinese orchestra and learn an instrument. And so it was through being in a community orchestra that I felt like I belonged for the first time. And I was with other teenagers that faced the same things at school. And so for once a week, I would feel very safe and in a place where I felt that I belonged. And because of that, I grew up and I wanted to make this happen for other people, other kids, anybody. And so currently I am the music director at the Toronto Chinese Orchestra, and it has been a struggle with finances and everything just to keep this orchestra afloat. But at the same time, we have a community where There's seniors, there's kids, there's teenagers, and they all come together to make beautiful music. And it's always been a challenge to find scores and things like that. But I always wanted to be a place where they felt safe and where they could just relax and make beautiful music together. And we don't just have Chinese people in our orchestra. We have people from different backgrounds as well. And we're welcoming people from other backgrounds. And because of this, I believe that community orchestras or community music making groups are very, very important. But as a Chinese orchestra in the diaspora, we face many challenges besides the financial. I grew up feeling like I was never really welcomed at the table, or people didn't know what to make of me because I play a Chinese instrument. So in my mind, it felt like the classical music or the classical Western orchestras, they were like the ivory tower. And if I had ideas that I would like to collaborate or want to share, I always felt like I was circling this ivory tower. And there was never really, I couldn't find a doorway. And after speaking to some people connected to the orchestras, they would say, yeah, I think it would be a little bit challenging to get your ideas or to have anything to do with collaborating. And yet I see programming where they, to fill out the EDI mandates, they would say, oh, okay, we'll have a Chinese player come and play Chopin at our concert. Or, we have a Chinese player in the orchestra. And they tick the boxes, and everybody seems to be quite happy with that. And so I always felt like, why doesn't anybody want to talk and have a dialogue? And so I would search for opportunities where our orchestra can collaborate with other cultures in the community. So we would do work together with a Japanese taiko troupe or Korean drummers. We did collaborations with Korean visual artists and Chinese artists. And so it became more multidisciplinary. But as far as support from outside the Chinese community, it was very difficult to find. But the happy thing is, Sandeep had this collaboration that we had 2 years ago, and I met musicians from different cultures. And what really, really caught my attention was we weren't just put together and say, oh, you play something Chinese, or you play something Indian, or you play something, from your culture. But it was more, he wanted us to get to know one another and actually dialogue with each other. And so we spent days together. And those days were amazing because we were able to actually get up close with the other instruments, get to know the other artists, and really, truly collaborate, I felt. And that is actually my utopia, I think. That's I would love to continue to strive for, because I think if we have that openness and that time and space to actually get to know one another and talk to each other and create together, beautiful things can happen. Thanks.
And that harks back a little bit to what Parmela said, right? About time strictures in traditional organizational formats that prevent a lot of these dialogues happening. Yeah. It's this.
Maybe I will. Thanks. It's a little bit easier, a little less precarious than dragging a cord all the way with all the glasses of water. xwélmexw, iltal squih, talitzel quad Skwah, chitzulatzel ta ok almach equala tata, holtramet chapta tamach. So hello, my name is Dylan Robinson in Halkmalin, which is the language that Stalo folks speak. I said who I was, where I'm from. So on my mother's side of the family, I'm Skwah from just outside of Vancouver. Our community is one of 27 different Stalo First Nations. So this is just outside of Vancouver, for those of you familiar with the settler colonial geography. I said thanks to our hosts, the Indigenous peoples of here, many folks who I have relations with, made friendships with over the years. I was very lucky to live in Toronto for 3.5 years, I guess not that long. But very happy to be back here. I also said xwélmexw is the way that we open gatherings. It's very important to us. It's a way to say hello, my good friends, but it also means respected leaders. And so that connotation is really important for us because it acknowledges that everyone that's gathered here has a role in leadership in the various areas that you work in to do the work that we're here to do. So xwélmexw. I'm going to read a little bit of a poetic thing. Part of that will be having you read a little bit of a poetic thing that's not there yet, don't worry. Eventually you will see words appear that I won't be reading, I won't be speaking, but you will be reading. And I think that's all I wanted to say to start off. Other than thanks for the invitation, I'm very happy to be here with friends and colleagues. So, just over a year ago, I moved home. After 8 years of living on and working on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe lands, based at the Queen's University in the Kingstown, I returned home to a place renamed after Captain George Vancouver. I returned to a place we, as xwélmexw Stalo folks, call xwélmexw, which means wide at bottom, and this is where the river widens. I returned to the lands of my downriver relatives, to xwélmexw, and I returned to the lands where I gather xwélmexw and Skwah, where my ancestors gathered xwélmexw and Skwah, and where my daughters and I continue to gather xwélmexw and Skwah, which are salmonberries and huckleberries in English. I return home to this place where my daughters learn our language, Halkamelem, and I learn as well from our Siam, from our leaders, from my family. So I've returned home. I've also found myself in a school of music. I found myself returned to memories of music rehearsal, technique, and practice. I should say I was not firmly in a school of music at Queen's University, even though I was affiliated. So this is where I am now. I hear scales through the walls, arpeggios behind closed doors, the repertoire repeated in bits and pieces. I've returned to the memory of practice, music performance and composition in particular, practices I left in my undergraduate degree because of racism, inflexibility, and conservatism that I experienced as a student 30 years ago. I've returned home to my love for music of dead white men and other kinds of music. Sometimes to experience other folks' love for this same music is suffocating. So, there's been a good amount of commissioning of work over the years by Indigenous composers and Indigenous artists. A good amount of collaboration to create new music. I'm much more interested, however, in the context of new music than in the context of new music than the content. The place, the seats, the room. I'm interested in that pamphlet that we get, that piece of paper we receive after we enter, that we hold and we fold up and place into our pockets or purses, that sometimes we read. I'm interested in that post-concert talk and other forms of talk. I'm interested to make new, to renew those structures, make additions, subtractions, multiplications through adaptation. I don't mean adaptation in the way we might think of a modern, updated version of a piece that merely places it in another locale or in present day. I'm instead interested to refocus the new away from the object we call new music and toward a renewal of the way we come to this place on Indigenous land. I'm interested how we note our arrivals and the way that we continue to arrive. As Indigenous folks, we have never simply adopted tools as is to build Indigenous versions of the master's house and master works, but instead to adapt them to our purposes. With such tools, our own and others' tools, we continue to carve, to weave, and build sovereignty as we have always done. I'm interested to use Indigenous tools, the tools at hand, to build this house where love and alienation, critique, and beautiful questions might live together. I hope this isn't a tower. I'm also interested in bracketing the initial presumption of mutual exclusion and incommensurability that we often come to when we think about difference or new music, you know, these kinds of things, dead white guys, or the love we have of Bach and the other things we do. We shouldn't be thinking of those as incommensurable. I'd like not to think of them in that way. We can imagine a whole range of awkwardnesses between these things that are supposedly incommensurable, a range of questions that lead us into other relations. For example, just two examples of many, how might I hear the life of new music and older music from Indigenous xwélmexw perspectives? What is Telman's Tafel music when felt through the lens of fatherhood or other kinship relations? Maybe it involves a baby eating spaghetti with their hands, spaghetti strewn across the floor, who knows? These are just a couple of potential awkwardnesses in this moment that I might want to spend time with, but really, the awkwardness is endless. To renew the sight and practice of new music here means saying yes to speculative processes for building relationships between that which may at first seem incommensurable. Yes to Indigenous lands back. Yes to Aldo Clementi. Yes to Indigenous resurgence. Yes to intimacy and set theory. Yes to abolition. Yes to Indigenous languages untranslated. Yes to orchestras, string quartets, choirs, and operas. Yes to visiting. Yes to entering the house as is. Yes to making it other than it is. Thank you.
Thank you all for this. Thank you all for these wonderful statements, and they open up many perspectives. That so I had a few thoughts that went through my head while listening to you. Anthony, why would it be still called classical music? I mean, is the term itself not only already something that is based on the kind of elitism that you were criticizing, classics coming from the highest tax bracket in Roman society? And that's what the highest tax bracket liked, was deemed to be the classic thing.
Should I respond?
Yeah, please.
I mean, my only response to this when I get asked this is like, why is a strawberry called a strawberry? It's just a word that stuck. And I've tried to think of a way to change this. I've tried to think of other names. But really the only thing that I do is say classical. And people get it. But I hate it. I mean, Debussy, Ravel, they hated impressionists, right? They hated that term, and it's stuck. So just like we're stuck with strawberry, we're stuck with classical.
Um, the haunting, Dylan. What haunts us? Or what are the hauntings? Where can they bring us? You know, when we start haunting ourselves or haunt ourselves.
I often think. Sorry, will you use this? I often think that we're not haunted enough. That we don't open ourselves to that. Well, haunting is a word. It means all kinds of things, obviously, too, like strawberry, like classical. But we do not open ourselves to that, the feel of alienation in what we do. I encounter quite often a lack, maybe not from the lovely folks that I know here, but a lack of desire for critical awareness that might come from that kind of, feeling on the back, like, oh, is this right? Is this norm really going on? Did I just hear that? We don't. So that's the kind of, I'd like to see folks take up. I don't know if one can choose to be haunted. That it might sort of do it out of being haunting. But it's a certain openness to that discomfort, and more than discomfort, with the norms that we participate in, and I think that can be very productive.
Thank you. Parmela, you also you expressed some hope that comes from the people who live here. Can you say more about the hope that you feel?
Well, two sides of the hope would be when it comes to Western art music. I think for me, any hope in its continuation rests there. The hope in actually the fact that this conversation is happening now, that Brian invited me here even after I left, out of frustration of the potential, the extraordinary potential that I saw in this city 30 years ago, but that I could never find a way to realize within the world that I inhabited, which, for better or worse, because I was a violinist, was the Western art music world. There is so much potential. And I have always had hope. One of my best friends calls me a puddle glum, which means someone who is very cynical, but at the end of that cynicism is actually hope. So, I've always had hope in potential. And, maybe after what's happened in the last 4 years of our, globally, but also in terms of the social justice music, social justice movement, maybe social justice music will happen next. Maybe, ideally, and as an ethnomusicologist, I do feel I am one of those ethnomusicologists who really believes that music reflects the society. And so we're not there yet. We haven't lived up to our potential. And that's why I come back to the Human Rights Declaration and that it's a promise. We're not there yet. It's a promise. And when music reflects that promise, okay, then maybe I can call it quits.
That ties up well with what you talked about, your experiences in this no man's land, so to speak, between being here but not being accepted here. I like this image of the tower, the tower of, or the wagons that are circled around classical orchestral projects. Do you have hope that things are changing through this last year? I mean, there's been really a upsurge of awareness and of hope, in a sense that a groundswell of understanding that there is more to a musical culture and a musical situation, a musical locality than just the classical, as you would say it, the classical music world and the art music world, or what I call a urological music world. Have you seen some changes? Have you seen also new opportunities for the specific? The thing is that you bring a certain identity or complex identity with you that you talked about, expressing this complex identity in some kind of way that feels good. So is there any movement there?
I do see things happening. It's rather slow, and sometimes it's very frustrating as well. With our orchestra, we had recently had the opportunity to partner with a university. So it was a community orchestra partnering with York University. And I mean, there has been bumps along the way, but at least there's that, we have one foot in the door. And I think the possibilities of collaborations are endless, and there's so much potential there. But it required a lot of convincing, which I think is sad in a way, because there's so many levels of, it's a hierarchy. I have to go starting from the bottom and then speak to all these people to try to even get them to consider it. But it was a process, and we're still, working things out. But at least I think that's a big step for us as a Chinese orchestra. But at the same time, I still see there's still gatekeepers. So as recent as last year, I was applying for a PhD program, and the professor who knew that I wanted to research Chinese orchestras in the diaspora made the comment, Chinese orchestras? Well, they're like Chinese restaurants. They're all over the place. And I was shocked that he made this statement, and but he didn't think there was anything wrong with it, and I was just stunned into silence. But then he just continued. But if this is the type of, I guess if this is still happening in academia now, it's very discouraging to come against that. So I think while things are moving forward, there's still things that need to be worked on.
There is something that maybe each of you can answer, the question that Parmela raised about professionalism, and that where you proposed another way of engaging with the whole idea of musicking, right? Not in the category of professional, non-professional, or what does it mean? What does this mean to you in your practice to think about whether things are professionally done or not? Or how do you engage with this in your context? Does it mean anything? Is it part of the exclusion, or is it?
I know. It's just like where to begin. I think so much is about the boundary making around supposed rigor and aesthetic mastery, and I still hear on a very regular basis these kind of very sharp lines being made around something like audition requirements in a school of music, to let in the others. how would we assess the the rigor of their if this was good playing or not? I just think it's just starting from the wrong question and the wrong point of entry. I think a lot about everyday aesthetics, and it's a strange way in maybe, but in the theater world, we can look at fluxus, we can look at all kinds of practices, where non-acting practices, right? Verbatim theater, well, maybe that's not a good example of verbatim theater, but practices that don't rely on the sort of virtuosity of the performer, and are just as aesthetically beautiful and engaging and open to a wide range of folks, different kinds of accessibility. And I feel like a lot of the time, I was saying this to you earlier, I meet a lot of folks who aren't just don't have exposure to that kind of aesthetic practice. And I think sometimes because of that, it doesn't really allow the imagination to think beyond the box of virtuosity, right? and I don't know what to do other than to say, like, hey, you should go watch some stuff, like engage with like Fluxus or whatever it might be, because you know your world isn't the only world. Sorry, there we go.
Yeah, I would like to. I like that you brought up virtuosity, because there's a book by Kat Hope and Louise Devenish, two Australian musicians, composers, called New Virtuosities, and it's precisely about this question. Virtuosity means, in a sense, you know, to be virtuous in music, which is not a term that is contentious in many ways, many contexts, but has become kidnapped by the notion of, you know, technical perfection or something like this. And as you say, that's the wrong question. And just maybe ask them to read this book.
Put it on the list.
Yeah, but maybe one professionalism, virtuosity. Are there in this word cloud? What does it evoke in you?
So I often think about what being an intelligent person means today. So I know a lot of older people who can basically recite all of the kings of England, and they can talk very eloquently about Turkish rug patterns or Greek coins or speak 7 languages. And what's interesting about how tech has formed society today is that we have information just available very, very quickly. So I think a lot of younger people don't feel the need to memorize a lot of stuff because they can Google it. And that's why we have a lot of people, younger people today, who don't know how to read maps, because we have a GPS that just tells you where to go. And when we think about what AI is doing for society, and how many of you have seen the movie The Congress? Yeah, it's one of these amazing movies. It was made in 2016. It's basically predicting what's going on right now and what's about to happen, I think, with society. When you think of people spending all of this time in VR rooms, right? We have people losing lots of weight playing this box game because they're so addicted to it that they play it for long periods of time and they don't eat. And it's extremely unhealthy. But this is the type of stuff that's going on basically unbeknownst to many people who still have some foot in the world of books and walking and appreciating nature.
The world of walking.
Right? So when I think of all of this and I relate it to the music world, we have 8-year-olds now playing, let's say, the Hammerklavier or a Prokofiev violin concerto. And we have institutions like Classic FM featuring these musicians. Not to say that these musicians aren't talented, but there's this mix of what I like to call circus obsession. Like, let's see the latest 4-year-old playing this Chopin concerto. And the people who aren't practitioners of classical music look at these videos and say, oh my goodness, this person is going to change the world. What usually happens is that person becomes an accountant, right? So what is professionalism when we think about being a musician? I think it's the ability to transform a soul. It's when you go to that concert and someone has revealed something to you about yourself, about the world, about the future, about the past, that you would never have imagined. The problem is we can't teach that specifically, but we can teach it indirectly. And the best teachers know how to do this. Who amongst the audience are musicians? Amazing, I love this. So you all know that the best teachers in your life have indirectly taught you this. And I just want to find a way moving forward to encapsulate that in pedagogy. No matter who you are, no matter what you play, no matter what genre it is. What is that word genre anyway? I mean, we should be post-genre. We're basically post-gender. So we should be post-genre at this moment, right? So yeah, more of that.
So good.
I think I'll just respond to the professionalism just because I'm the one who brought it up, and because I don't. So my further question would be, how many people perform in this room are like regular performers? Because it's in the world of performance that I find, and actually I wanted to speak to that as the performer on the panel, someone who's not necessarily an organizer, but I deal with performers. I deal with my colleagues in orchestras who are intransigent about going 1 minute past the hour, about giving any leeway in time if they're working with somebody from a different tradition. And so it's like that kind of the professional structures, the Federation of Musicians and all that kind of thing. And that's part of the systemic learned behavior. And that's what I think needs to change. I appreciate your term professionalism, so I would call that the artist. To me, that's artistry. But I appreciate, professionalism. And I don't think orchestral musicians are artists. That's why I call them recreators. They're not the creators, they're the recreators. And that's their, when they're practicing that virtuosity, it's not about doing something different. It's about doing it like the recording did it. And that's something very different. I don't know. It's my frustration.
That ties into something that Dylan said before about repositioning the word new, taking it away from new music or taking it away from, and putting it more into a context of renewal of because you were talking about how you can love Bach and you can love these composers because they were not like the orchestra musician of today, because they were also artists, and they just did what they did from their perspective in a usually marginal way too, and it has become co-opted. And so the renewal means maybe to prize them away from what they have been, the incrustations on their image and on their art and on the way they have been used, which is what good artists then do when they perform. They take that away. They take all these layers away and get back to something that is more the burning issue that you were talking about, which might be I like your definition of professionalism there very much. You brought up pedagogy too, and I know that's a concern of yours too, and of yours too. How to be a music teacher in going forward in this changing perspectives of what are these institutions that we teach people for. Conservators are teaching people to go into these orchestras, to go into these tightly organized, Fordist kind of music making structures. How does this change? Can this change? Is there movement? Do you see movement in new kinds of music education that can establish themselves as maybe dominant, not dominant, but just pervasive forms of how we can change music making?
I think it starts from the ground up, basically. So if young children are exposed to music of other cultures, not just the recorder in the beginning or ukulele, I think there's the world can really be open to them. And I remember I did a workshop recently where it was to a group of 5 and 6 year olds, and I was introducing Chinese instruments and Chinese music to this group. And at the end, I would say, I said, does anybody have any questions? And this one little boy, he was jumping up and down and waving his arms. And I said, oh, yes, do you have a question? And he goes, I'm Chinese. So that was amazing to me, because when I was young, I didn't want people to notice me. I just wanted to blend in. But he was so proud that somebody of his heritage was telling people, his classmates, about Chinese music. And I think that is priceless. Like if we can get, you know, people from different cultures into the classrooms, and not just like Asian Heritage Month, but you know, something more regular. This would be a start. And even in the in universities, the students there are going to be the concert goers, the sponsors, donors eventually. And if they never have heard Indian music or Chinese music or any other types of music, then what would attract them to go to watch these performances?
Just to build on that a little bit, I really feel like I don't want to make such a sweeping generalization, but I do want to say this strongly, that there is a crisis of imagination in music schools. I say that, you know, with great admiration for a lot of my colleagues and the work they do. But when you have such a tightly controlled schedule, and, you know, we just did a survey in our school, and, you know, students have like the minimum 12-hour work days who do performance, and then they come home and they can't live in Vancouver because it's too expensive, so home is out in Coquitlam or Surrey or wherever, 2 hours away, and then they do homework. And so, like, where is the time? It's not just that there's no time for, you know, working in collaboration. There's actually no time for imagination. There's no time for creativity and thinking about what my role is as an artist or someone in the world. And that's on all levels. That's also in terms of curriculum. You know, I have students, I have performance students in my classes who are amazing and who leave at about the 2/3 of the way part through the course because they can't make it through all of the performance activities that they have to do and do my class. So they're, and you know, are thankful when I'm so supportive and say, like, you know, I just want you to not burn yourself out. So there's this kind of self-sacrificing that goes on there too. It's one of the most disheartening things to me. And I should also say I taught a class this term. It was amazing on interdisciplinary collaboration that had a number of musicians and artists from across the university. And one of the best, most heartwarming things was when students said, you know, thank you so much for allowing us to work with each other. We haven't worked with another artist from another discipline in our entire time, and we're in our 4th year now. So there's a shock for me in that, but also like, oh, good. At least, you know, here at the end, we are at the end, but you have this as a starting point. Yeah.
Do you want to? Sorry, I should speak into the microphone.
I don't know. I was thinking earlier about a few years ago I did a survey of, so this is going from, you know, to Bill and what Patty said, from the ground up. I did a survey of the curricula from across the country, of all the provinces and the territories across the country. And except for Alberta, who hadn't renewed their curriculum since 1989. It has since been, no, it's since been done, but at the time it wasn't. But every curriculum talked about the need for teachers to be open to the fact that they will have students who will come from, you know, different cultures and will probably want to bring they may or may not want to bring their ethnocultural heritage into the class. And then it is the teacher's responsibility to be able to gauge that child's musicality or musicianship based on that other culture. How many educators can do that? And then at the end, when you get to high school, the criteria, intonation, being able to read a rhythm correctly, being able to sing in tune and play a scale. So there's a fundamental disconnect in the philosophy and then the expectation. So, that's where it's like from the ground up, how are we going to do it? And again, it can't just be in Asian Heritage Month. It can't just be once in a year. With this philosophy has to be embedded into the way that we educate the next generation from from elementary school all the way up through high school. Most of your high school students, so I haven't been able to get a gig in any kind of classical department. So I'm working in a jazz department right now, which is very intriguing, where the kids are actually much more open. But the jazz students have become jazz students because that's what they learned in high school, because that's what's still in the high school. Classical programs aren't there anymore. So
I would take this as a moment of transition to end the conversation. Thank you all for listening to us and being so constructive with your statements and of course, thank you, my friends. This was really wonderful discussion and the best thing about it was that it was just skimming the surface. So there's lots below that we can tap into in the future. Thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you.